Hello, everybody. This is Jeff de la Beaujardière. Welcome to the second virtual CISL seminar and the last one of 2020. Today's speaker is Jason Armbruster from the University of Colorado. Jason is the Enterprise Cloud Architect for CU Boulder and the co-lead of Heroic, which is the Higher Education and Research Operations in the Cloud meetup. Jason has spent 20 years in various University of Colorado IT organizations, architecting and building IT systems. Most recently, Jason joined CU Boulder OIT in 2017 to focus on bringing the benefits of public cloud to CU. And he'll be speaking to us today on balancing order and flexibility, managing diverse workloads in a common AWS environment at CU Boulder. There will be, I think, a total of 3 polls during the talk. You will scroll down below the slides when it's the right time to access those polls. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Slido, which is, you have a link in the calendar, and we'll address those at the end of the talk. Thank you so much. Jason?
All right, thanks a lot, Jeff. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to listen to the talk today. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about balance today. So I thought we'd start right off the bat with a poll here, and wanted to talk as we jump into this poll about balance. So 2 questions here. The first one is looking at the benefits of public cloud. So I'm interested in, from the audience, about what do you see as the most important benefits of the public cloud? The second poll, when we get there, will be about the risks. So again, talking about balance here, what are the benefits, what are the risks? So go ahead and jump in, and we'll pop up the results here in just a second. What do you think are the most important benefits of public cloud? All right, looks like we have a pretty good range there of those top 3 or 4 answers there. Oh, everybody jumped on the compute and storage when I need it. All right. That seems to be a very popular one. All right, why don't we go ahead and close that one out and move on to the risks. So now jumping into the risk side of the equation, what do people see as the biggest risks of using public cloud services? And the reason I want to look at this is we're going to talk a lot today about the balance between these two and kind of how we strike the lines around managing these, the balance here. Security seems to be an early popular learning curve, okay. All the above, locked in. All right, that's good. Good stuff. Yeah, so I mean, I think we see some common ideas here that we definitely want access to the benefits of the public cloud, but we also want to make sure that we're looking out for those risks that we see there. My apologies, the button to share was too close to the button to leave. Let's try that again. So like we talked about, there's a balance there, right? And so when we looked at this problem, we said, okay, what problem are we solving here? And in the world before AWS, I think we can all say IT was largely purchased in large chunks. Those with the money to purchase often determined who could do what, and the costs were sunk. So we better use what we have, and we can't use more than we have. And I think we saw that in the benefits there. A lot of people are looking in the public cloud for compute when I need it, and as much compute as I need. AWS and others certainly opened up a world where I, as an individual, assuming I have a large enough credit limit, can access almost unlimited compute power without asking for permission. There's a challenge with that, though. When you scale that up to a large enterprise like CU Boulder, that means thousands of individuals with reasonable credit limits have a lot of access to a lot of compute without asking for permission. But we need to figure out, how do we make sure the right people pay for that? How do we make sure the right people have access? How do we move data around? How do we understand the security? A lot of those things that came up on the risk side there. What about when somebody leaves the university? And I didn't even put on here things like, what do we do about regulated data? What do we do about things where we actually have compliance requirements around the data? All those kind of things. So those are the kind of problems that we hope to solve with the service that we're building right now. And that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So I like to start kind of with this, what I call the cloud hierarchy of needs here. Credit to Maslow. When I think about what I want to do with a cloud account, kind of from the perspective of the cloud user, the first thing I want to understand is, how do I buy this stuff? Then how do I pay my bill? How do I sign in? How do I get on the network? How do I deal with security? And then I can finally get to doing the work that I actually wanted to do. But from the perspective of the enterprise, all of these things come in as well. So the purchasing and billing really gets down to cost allocation. Those questions about, how do I figure out who spent this and who should pay for it? Authentication really comes back to the general question of identity and access management. How do I figure out who this person is, what they should have access to, when they should have access to it, from where, all those kind of standard questions about how do we get into it. Networking gets into the networking architectures around, how do we connect this up? We've got a lot of networking on campus and a lot of data, and we need to move things into the cloud in relatively easy ways. And then all of the security standards that we want to hopefully layer on top of that. Now, all of that could be done very, very narrowly from an enterprise perspective, but the bottom line is we need to enable that top layer there. We don't want to get in the way of people actually getting the work done. So how do we do that in a balanced way? So I want to go make sure we start with the level set of, we do have ways of solving these problems. It's not like we're inventing this from whole cloth. We do have cost centers in the university. We've had active access groups in the directory for years and years and years. We've had security zones in the network. We've had compliance reviews. All these things exist. So what we're doing here is trying to figure out, how do we map these to the cloud? How do we, and when we do that in the cloud, do we have tools that can match the complexity of the university? And I just threw one example in here from the university setting. One person is often a PI on multiple grants, which means they need to charge things to multiple cost centers. They might be teaching a class at the same time, which is a separate cost center. And by the way, when you're teaching, you often can get grants from the cloud providers. You might for the research as well, but teaching is one place where we get a lot of education grants, and I want to take advantage of those. I might be delegating control to multiple sets of people based on those different roles. And I might be doing work on different data classifications. So all of these things apply to this one person. And it's not easy for me to say that one person's data all lives in one cloud account or one space, and I can apply all those different things to it. So these are the kinds of problems that we're dealing with as we try and figure out how to map onto this. So when I was first hired, my boss gave me this statement. This was the vision of what we were going to do. So we wanted to do multi-provider public cloud, and we are working towards that. We've really focused on AWS so far, but we are working towards rolling out across multiple public clouds. We wanted to serve hybrid configurations. So we're not just focused on the situation where somebody puts something in the cloud alone. We really need to deal with things moving back and forth from campus, sometimes bursting to cloud, sometimes moving to cloud and then moving back. We need to look at administrative, teaching and learning, and research needs. So all those things I just talked about across the spectrum. And my job is to be the central point of contact, acting as a broker for these cloud services. So this was a pretty broad vision we had in mind of, how do we approach this and try to enable cloud usage, again, without getting in the way of the things that people need to get done, but hopefully making it easier for people to get started. This was an early picture that we put together of kind of what is it going to take to get this done. And the thing I like about this is not so much the detail. I didn't expect anybody to be able to read the little words here, but the big picture of, there's kind of three big areas here. It's easy to think about the technology and the infrastructure side of this. That piece is obvious. We need some technology here. There's a bunch of stuff on the business side that we need to think about here. There's a bunch of pieces around, how do we do contracting and legal? How do we do grants in this world? How do we do procurement? All that kind of stuff that we needed to think through. And then what we were calling at the time cloudification, some have called cyber infrastructure. There's lots of different terms for this. I think the one I like most these days is really cloud enablement. But this is really about like, okay, so I have a cloud account or I have some access to public cloud. What do I do with it? How do I make use of it? Because in many cases, if I were to take the cloud and treat it as a server that I might have in a rack in a data center, I'm wasting a lot of money. And I'm also wasting a lot of opportunity that I might have in a public cloud. So having resources available that help people figure out the best ways to use cloud is a really important part of this equation as well. So phase one, what did we do first? And this is just a little short story on kind of how we've worked over the last several years. So we worked with one kind of pilot group. Our data analytics group was looking at really wanting to take advantage of the cloud. They seemed they felt like they had a good use case for it. And they wanted to work in AWS. And so it was a great situation where I had a customer who wanted to work in the cloud, and so I could basically serve one customer and get started. We called ourselves the cloud broker. We went to them and we said, what can we do for you? And they basically said, here's the stuff we don't want to manage. And we had a lot of conversations with them early on about basically they wanted us to keep them from shooting themselves in the foot. So manage our identity and access management for us, manage our networking, manage our security for us, but don't get in our way. And we quickly realized that those two things didn't really match very well. Keep me from shooting myself in the foot often means don't give me enough power to actually get my job done. Identity and access management in AWS is extremely granular. For us to be able to manage that entirely for them meant constantly going back and forth on, I need one more permission, I need one more permission, I need one more permission. And then they need to come back to them on a regular basis and say, do you still need all those permissions, to make sure that we were minimizing things over time. We did find through this, though, that there were certain things in the networking and baseline security that could be refactored and we could use across many different accounts. And you'll see that show up later. The other thing we really learned here is that when you work across groups like this, culture and work style really matter. And we had some interesting clashes across these groups in the early phases. So coming out of that and using the lessons learned, we said, okay, we're going to scale up our AWS deployment. And this is really where we got into what AWS calls a landing zone. Today, with our landing zone, we're at about 60 active accounts. Interesting fact, last week when I put the slide together, we were actually at 50. So shows that we can scale this up very fast. We're continuing to grow this every week. We support 3 network architectures today, although we'll tell you only 2 of them are really actively used. But we early on kind of factored out of that initial discovery these 3 ideas. Cloud only was really the idea of, I don't care about the campus. I don't care if the campus exists. I just want to live in the cloud completely. Campus only was the idea of, I don't really want to be in the cloud, but I need extra compute or I need extra access. And so I want to be able to bubble out to the cloud, but I don't want it to be exposed to the internet. I don't want the internet to be aware of the fact that this exists. I just want it to basically show up to campus. And then the hybrid scenario where I'm going to still connect back to some services on campus, but I'm actually going to put a front end out that might be accessible from the internet or might be more broadly accessible than the campus at least. I said 2 of these are the most likely. The cloud only and the hybrid are the ones that I see most broadly used today. We're actually not seeing a lot of campus only today in terms of the 60 accounts that we're using. The other thing we started talking about was security levels. That first use case was actually what we call highly confidential data, which includes personally identifiable data and things like that. And so we did a lot of work on security controls. We quickly found that most of our customers were not going to be at that level of security. They were dealing with public data and needed to basically make sure that people were not hacking into their accounts and misusing them, that the controls were in place to detect that kind of stuff, that they were following best practices, but they didn't need the higher level security controls that you would have if you were storing truly highly confidential data. And so we built out these security levels. We really started focusing on public data, and then we have confidential and highly confidential on our roadmap. But those are right now, today, if you come to us and you say, I'm storing that kind of data, we say, here's how we can help you based on prior use cases. And there's a whole lot of work that the application team does. So these are some graphics we put together to kind of show how people use our service today. Basically, there's 3 ways of engaging with us. You can come to us and you do that top line, which I call direct use, which is basically, we'll give you a cloud account and you go do your thing. And we'll stay out of your way. We basically just set it up for you. We make it work for the initial stuff work for you, and we keep it kind of maintained over time with our best practice standards. But what you do in the account is completely up to you. Second step is you can engage with us and you can use some consulting. This is a model we're still trying to figure out the best ways to approach, honestly. We've got a few different groups that work with different groups on campus generally on technology consulting, and we're engaging with them with the cloud, but it's still something we're exploring. And then sort of the third one is OIT being our IT group, where we're going to actually deploy our products and services on the cloud. And so I have groups within OIT that are working with my team to come in and use public cloud to deploy their services. All of those ride on that foundation, which deals with the security network, single sign-on billing, and the contract that we put in place. This is sort of the snapshot that we've built out of kind of where are we. trying to show that we are going to go to Azure, we are going to go to Google Cloud, but you can see a lot of X's in those columns. We're not very far along on those things, but we're building out really around AWS and our focus there. So I'd like to do another poll here because I want to kind of delve down now into the AWS specifics, and I'd like to get a sense from everybody about what your familiarity is with AWS. If we could bring up that poll. This is really to get a sense of how familiar are you with AWS technologies? Have you used them before? Are you familiar with organizations? Because I'd like to kind of dig down into these things, and I don't want to bore you. So if you can give me a sense of kind of where are you and okay, that's pretty good. That's kind of what I expected. Most people have some familiarity with AWS, probably have used it for at least some workloads. Few people familiar with a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, but it doesn't sound like everybody is. So hopefully this won't be too high level for you. Happy to dive down in more in some of the questions when we get there if it turns out to be too high level. So why don't we go ahead and go back to the slides, and I will try not to lose you this time. All right. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the landing zone architecture. The key thing here, and I guess the analogy I would use here is landing zone architecture really focuses you on the account as a primary container. And the way I think about this is when I was in college, when we first started out sharing a refrigerator, everybody had to put their name on every piece of food. And a lot of cloud use cases kind of start with that mindset where you say, we're going to tag everything. Every single thing we put out there is going to have a tag on it. And then we can keep track of whose thing is tagged according to that tag, right? And that pretty quickly gets hard to do. There's a couple reasons for that. One is not everything can actually take a tag. In AWS, they're getting better at it, but there were quite a few things actually you could create in AWS that actually didn't support tagging for a while. And the other side of that is it's just a lot of stuff to manage. I'm not saying tagging can't be a good structure. It actually is important, but it quickly gets pretty hard to manage. So when I was in college, we quickly got to the shelf method where I got the top shelf, my other roommate got the middle shelf, and somebody else got the bottom shelf. And I kind of use that analogy here of each person gets an account, and we kind of use that as the primary container, and then we use tagging as a secondary level. So if we, for some reason, the shelf method isn't working out, then we can use tags on top of that. But we use the AWS account as a kind of a primary container, and it's a container for these four things. So it's a container for cost, number one, which is really where the tagging kind of thing comes in, is who's paying for this. So every account maps to one cost center in our current organization. It's also a security boundary, though. AWS does a good job of saying what's in the account can only talk to other things in the account, except when you're very explicit about enabling cross-account permissions. There were a couple places where this wasn't 100% true, and they've actually gone back and patched that up. So it's really nice where you have to both say, if you're going to enable cross-account permissions, you have to say in the sending account, it's okay to send, and in the receiving account, it's okay to receive. So both parties have to agree if you're going to do that. Otherwise, you have these really strict security boundaries around an account. So it's a nice way to think about what your boundaries are there. It's also a boundary for account management or access management. So I can give access to a particular account, to a role within that account that has certain access, and that access only applies to that account. And then configuration deployment or blast radius, and this really comes into account for perspective for like development versus production. So in some cases, I want to do automated deployment. I might want to deploy in a separate account for development than I do for production, because I don't want my development deployment to actually blow up production. AWS has a service they call Control Tower. That's a really good starting point for this. It doesn't do all of the landing zone things that we do, but it certainly is a good starting point, and we use it as kind of the foundation for what we want to do. more and more of the landing zone stuff can be managed from outside of an AWS account also, which makes it more and more likely that what we give the customer looks like an AWS account that they would get if they put down their credit card, which is, I think, a really nice part of the service is that they really don't see a whole lot of difference in the account generally. There's still a few things that we can't quite get there, but we're more and more able to do that. This is kind of a high level picture of what our landing zone looks like. I won't go through all the details here other than to say we've been able to use a lot of on-premise identity and access management infrastructure that was already in place to manage this pieces of this. We're also able to manage a whole lot of AWS services, or to use a whole lot of AWS services right out of the box to accomplish a lot of the things that we needed to do in our landing zone. So the next thing that's a big part of this, and this is really key to any landing zone, but AWS's version of this is organizations. Organizations gives you the ability to basically take those accounts and put them into a hierarchical structure. So you can create organizational units, and organizational units fit into a tree structure. And then you can apply policy to each branch in the tree, essentially, and they call those service control policies. It also allows you to share resources between different pieces of the tree. So I can say, I have an account that is my audit log account for the entire organization, for instance. This is really great because now I can say to my security folks, I have an audit log of everything that happens in the organization. Everybody who logs in, everything they change, and what they changed. And nobody in any account can touch that audit log. So if you've ever had to go through a compliance review, that audit log is sort of a baseline requirement of most compliance reviews, and it can be very hard to create in a lot of other situations. I can now create that across my entire organization, and it's very straightforward in this setup. So organizations is a really, really important tool here. It's also nice when I talked about those cross-account structures to be able to start to group things into organizational units and start to trust things across organizational units as well. So we're just starting to get into some of that capability. The other thing we've done is we built out what we call an account baseline template. And this is where we say, this is what actually goes in the account. Like I said, well, this is being minimized over time, but we still have certain things we have to put into the account. And this is where we get into what security controls do we put in? What network are we laying down for you? And today it's AWS, but eventually we also ask you, what public cloud do you want it in? And so we'll be able to put some things in other public clouds in the future. So once we have the ability to spin up those accounts, of course, now we get back to our hierarchy of needs. How do we implement those things? So contracting billing, this was really important. We were able to use the Internet 2 Net Plus agreement. It's worth looking into whether you can use this or not. I know not everybody's going to be eligible to use this, but I wanted to kind of highlight the key things that we liked about this. One is we've been able to standardize the terms and conditions across the entire university. Before this, a lot of people were going in with their credit cards and using the click-through agreement. Some departments had decided that they wanted to sign a contract directly with AWS. Everybody kind of ended up with different terms and conditions. We were able to really standardize this, which has made a big difference in terms of the way that we work with AWS. We were able to get access to a cloud checker, which is a basic cost management tool. That's been helpful for us. The big thing, though, is that DLT, which is the reseller under this agreement, does account level invoicing. So I'm able to send them a map of these accounts go to these cost codes, and I can be hands off from then on, which is a huge win for me, because otherwise I would have to employ someone to do that bill split on a monthly basis. And I don't have to do that. They do all that for me. It comes into the university already split up. And that has made this account level work it's made it much, much better for us. The other thing here that I think is really important, anybody who's looking at a reseller agreement, is we get full access to the AWS console and all our linked accounts. So the reseller's not doing anything on our behalf. We can log into the AWS console and we use it just like any credit card account. And again, this is important when I go to people and say, wouldn't you like to use our service? Because if they can't get access to the AWS console, why would they want to use our service? They can just go use a credit card and lay it down and use it the regular way. Identity and access management, for us, we were able to, like I said, take advantage of some of the existing infrastructure. So we have Shibboleth and Grouper in place at CU. We're able to basically build our groups in Grouper. And the wonderful thing about Grouper is that I can delegate management of those groups. And so I can say to a customer, you're in control of who's in this group. I define how the group's set up. And That basically allows me to then map that to a role through SAML into AWS. So I don't have any users defined in AWS. I don't have anybody who needs to go into AWS and create new users and reset passwords or any of that kind of stuff. That's all managed in our existing identity management system. But I'm able to basically map those identities into the cloud. And this is a really, really important thing for us going forward. And like I said, I'm able to then delegate the management of that group down to the customer so that they can decide who actually has that access at any given time. We've also experimented with allowing them to define their own role in group mappings, which has been super powerful for some groups that really need more advanced role capabilities. We're also currently evaluating whether groupers SCIM support can help us move from direct access SAML to AWS SSO. AWS is increasingly using SSO for new tools. That's kind of their, well, it's their single sign-on product, but it's increasingly being used internal to AWS for more user-friendly single sign-on. But I need to be able to map these groups into the AWS SSO groups, which is where SCIM support comes in. So that's kind of where we're headed from here. On the networking side, we started with all VPN. So every account that I spun up that wanted that hybrid model that I talked about would get a VPN connection back to campus. My networking folks loved that when I had about 40 VPN connections set up for 40 different accounts. We quickly started looking at how do we consolidate that. And AWS introduced Transit Gateway, which is essentially a virtual router. So I can basically stand up a transit gateway and consolidate all those. And so I've been able to gradually begin to consolidate multiple connections down to a single network access point. The nice thing about that is I have the control of both do those connections route back to campus, but also do they talk to each other? And I'm able to implement a little bit of routing policy at that transit gateway so that I start to get a more traditional networking routing policy control point in my AWS network. But it also greatly simplifies my spin up time on a new AWS account, where before I had to spin up the AWS account, cut a ticket to my network folks, they'd have to configure the VPN, and then they'd have to come back to me, and then I could hand it off to the customer. Now I can do this all with an API call, and the entire account setup now takes about an hour. So the transit gateway is definitely a big win for us. The other thing I like about it is we're back-ending the transit gateway today with VPN back to campus, but we can quickly switch out the back end as we look at Internet 2 has some shared access direct connect offerings, or we could do direct connect ourselves, which is a leased line option into AWS as we increase our usage or as we have lower latency network requirements. Key thing I wanted to throw out here, this does introduce some cracks in the wall though of the account-based cost accounting, because some of these costs become shared, and this is one of those places where tagging doesn't quite serve you. It's very hard to break out your network costs when you start to go down the road of direct connect or some of these other places. Even transit gateway has a little bit of shared cost. And so it is, you do start to get back into a model where you either have to have a shared good cost model or you have to figure out how to split up costs. So we're working through those issues. This picture I just threw in here for the far left there, that's kind of where we're headed in terms of the transit gateway connecting to our customer VPCs. We are also looking at, there's a DNS resolver that we can throw down at the bottom there also, which consolidates our DNS. Which will also help us do hybrid DNS resolution in a more simple and straightforward way going forward. And then the last piece is the security and compliance piece. We've really tried as much as we can here to use all AWS tools. We are forwarding our audit logs into our on-premise security event management tool. And so that has been one piece that we've done that's on premise, but other than that, we've basically used out of the box AWS pieces. So GuardDuty and Security Hub are really important pieces. GuardDuty is essentially their intrusion detection product. It looks at DNS resolution logs, it looks at network flow logs, and looks at a couple other things, and does signature-based detection of activity. So early on, it'll detect easy things like somebody's Bitcoin mining in your account. Over time, it's been able to detect more things like, hey, somebody's trying to attack your SSH port. And they're getting more and more signatures into that over time, and that's been really, really helpful. Security Hub kind of does the opposite, where it looks at your configuration of your AWS services and can check them against best practices. So we've been implementing the AWS best practice checks as well as the CIS best practice checks. And those are both kind of standard ways of looking at, are you doing the right thing in terms of locking down your AWS accounts? And those are really important for just our public data level. As we move into the higher data levels, we will implement other checks in Security Hub that will give us additional confidence that we're doing the right thing in those higher data security levels. This is where organizations also helps us, because we'll be able to implement those higher level data security checks only for specific organizational units. So we can say this organizational unit stores confidential data, and then we can implement certain checks only in that organizational unit. So again, having this structure allows us to kind of target our policy that way. So that was mostly what I wanted to cover today. So really, from there, I'd like to open it up and see what questions everybody has and what else I can talk to you about.
Great, Jason, thank you very much. I really liked your fridge analogy. I would invite people to add questions to the Slido at the bottom. I actually had a couple myself, which I'm going to put in. I think once we get some questions, I will read them out and you can answer them. Let me get back to the Slido for a second. Well, I've missed it. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and ask you this one, and then while you're answering it, I'm going to paste another one, but I do invite other people to do. So you mentioned that sometimes you do consulting, that OIT does consulting. You know, is that just on this business of accounts and security and billing and so forth, or are you also helping people if they want to know, you know, how do I actually architect my service? I want to move to using Lambda serverless. What, you know, do you get into that level of detail with them, or not really?
Yeah, we certainly do. Right now, a lot of our consulting is a little bit on a time available basis, to be honest. So that's, we haven't published a lot of formal offerings around consulting, but I would say we hit all of these areas. We definitely have had people who specifically ask us for billing kind of questions, especially the kind of question of, hey, I think I'm spending too much. Can you help me tune up my bill? So that's been definitely a common case. Definitely around security controls and how can I best meet these things, but definitely the architecture cases as well. You know, as people are replatforming and looking at serverless, that's been a common conversation we've had about what's the best way to approach this. How might I take advantage of serverless? What should I look out for? A lot of those things, I've had conversations with people, and we're increasingly bringing other folks in the OIT staff up to speed on.
Great, thanks. It looks like we have a question from Dan. Do you use any infrastructure as code tools, CloudFormation, Terraform, et cetera? And if so, what has or hasn't worked?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of infrastructure as code. I think it's really necessary to be successful in this kind of environment. My team in particular uses Terraform. It strikes a good balance, I think, between the ability to write something in relatively readable structures for someone who's not a programmer, and the power to do things that are slightly more complex. And so for the kind of work that we're doing, we found Terraform to be very successful. Over the last year, we've actually spent a fair amount of time using a tool called TerraTest to build in test-driven development around our Terraform. And that's really brought a lot of power to that structure. We have teams at Boulder who have used about every infrastructure as code tool that's out there in one form or another. So I don't think I've had any that people have said are just terrible. I think there are strengths and weaknesses of all of them. We've probably had more usage, though, of Terraform than any other. I think the other thing that drives Terraform to be to have more usage is the perception, at least, that it's multi-cloud, which I always tell people it's worth thinking about it from that perspective, because it is a common language and it is a common tool set for doing multi-cloud. That does not imply, and no one should go in with the understanding that you can take something from AWS that you wrote and deploy it on Azure or GCP. It does not work that way. You have to rewrite things to move from Azure, AWS to Azure with Terraform, but it does give you a common language and a common tool set for doing it. And so, for instance, as we move our landing zone concepts from AWS into Azure, we are writing more Terraform to move that into Azure.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question from Curious is the name listed. What impacts has the pandemic had on your workload and the security concerns for students and staff?
That's a good question. I would say that the biggest initial impact it had was a lot of interest in looking at virtual desktop technologies. Both AWS and Microsoft Azure have strength in the virtual desktop arena. And so we did a lot of work with multiple customers on virtual desktops and looking at different options there. So that's kind of the main technology focus. As far as, and it drove workload for sure. We spent a lot of time on that. As far as security concerns, I don't know that it's changed things a lot from that perspective. I think that we were already very focused on the idea that we needed to allow people to manage their accounts regardless of network location and still do that securely from day one. So we weren't really focused on network location as being a really important part of our strategy. And that enabled us to quickly move to a point where people were working in different locations without a lot of impact to our services. Services that were more dependent on network location really felt that more than we did.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And next question from Chris. Do you see a lot of cost with moving data around from on-prem to cloud and then back again?
So yeah, this is always a question that comes up for folks. And it's interesting because I think that what I hear from people is this never comes up in the corporate world, and it always comes up in the research and education world. First of all, know that every cloud provider will let you move the data to the cloud for free. They want it there. So you never have to worry about moving the data there. It's always about moving it back. That being said, this hasn't been a major issue for us. First of all of the cloud providers have research and education waivers around their data egress fees. And so make sure you're taking advantage of those, because it doesn't mean they'll waive 100%, but they all have caps on how much they'll charge you around their data egress. In the case of AWS, I believe the current terms are it can never be more than 15% of your total bill. And so we actually see small refunds every month for our data egress, and that has certainly helped, but it's not a significant part of our bill today. And that includes a situation where we're running data lakes in the cloud, so we are certainly pulling a fair amount of data from on-premise into the cloud.
Great, thank you. There was a follow-up question about your previous one where you mentioned virtual desktops. So Chris asked, have those virtual desktops been mainly focused on Windows or Linux?
Mostly focused on Windows in our case, because we're mostly looking at student workloads, and they're mostly running software that needs to run on Windows.
Okay. Brian asks, you mentioned the complexity of IAM roles, among others. Is this something where AWS responds to feedback, or is it entirely on your team to deal with?
I think we've definitely seen that they've responded to feedback. They've introduced some tools that have made it easier to analyze what you're doing with your IAM roles. They have I'm going to forget the term for it right now, but it's essentially a action analyzer where you can look at, is this doing what I expect it to do? And then they have sort of a tool that we can use at the organization level to say, are there any roles in my organization that are doing things I wouldn't expect, like giving access to some account that's outside my organization that I haven't listed on a specific allow list, for instance. So there are some things like that they're providing you some tools to do a better job of managing them. That doesn't get rid of the complexity, but it does give you some better tools. So I think that they're responding to some feedback around that. There's a bit of it that is sort of inherent to the problem, I will say. So I don't think it's completely their fault. They have a lot of services, and those services have a lot of potential actions, and they need to allow you the granularity to say those actions are allowed or not. And so there's just sort of a combinatoric explosion that happens with that is inherent to the problem as well. But I do see them giving you better tools to deal with it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, Anderson asks, it appears that your work is mostly AWS oriented. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on how to deal with cloud lock-in and open standards?
Yeah, our work is definitely mostly AWS today, although I will say I've spent probably 80% of my time in the last 6 months working on Microsoft Azure. So definitely working in the direction of multi-cloud. I think there's a couple of ways to look at this, in my opinion. Lock-in is not a yes or no question, in my opinion. It's a spectrum. And so I always try to evaluate this on how much value am I going to get from that additional step into lock-in versus what am I paying for it, right? What was the long-term cost of it? So if it's truly the kind of workload where there's a really important reason why it needs to move around on a regular basis, if it's a research workload where I need to be able to hand it to somebody else and they need to be able to run it on whatever they have access to, then lock-in is really bad. If it's the kind of thing where my organization is committed to running on AWS for the foreseeable future, and I can get it out the door 6 months earlier because I can take advantage of a service, then the lock-in might not be that big a deal. So I think it's important to look at that on that spectrum and figure out where do you fall on that spectrum, first of all. Then once you understand that, then I think there's an opportunity to look at open standards and figure out, do I look at containers? Do I look at Kubernetes? Do I look at things like that would allow me a little bit more flexibility between providers? But recognize that anytime you look at an open standard across clouds, you tend to lose some of the special things about that cloud. And you pay for that often in spending people time in running those services. And so that trade-off comes at a cost, and you just have to figure out where you fall and make the appropriate choice for your workload.
Yeah, thank you very much. The analogy I've heard is that not using some of the specific services would be like buying an Oracle license and then not using any of the kind of extras you get by having Oracle versus an open source database.
Yeah,
you get certain benefits. Next question was actually asked by me. Does AWS organizations let you easily move sub-organizations in the tree? Like if a group moves to another department, or do you have to sort of rebuild? Like if you do a reorg, can you reflect that easily in AWS organizations as needed?
Yeah. So if you're talking about moving parts of the tree around, that's no big deal at all. It's relatively straightforward to say I have this part of the tree and I want to move it over here, or I have this set of accounts that's in the tree and I want to move it over here. When I first read this, I thought it might have meant, can I take an organization that someone else has created and bring it into my organization? That is not easy to do today. In fact, as far as I know, it's not even possible. So that we've run into a couple of times where someone has started up a small organization and we've actually had to kind of tear it back down to the individual accounts, bring them in, and then reconstruct the structure because it's not possible. But if you're just talking about moving things around once they're in the organization, yeah, that's no big deal at all. With the caveat that you have to understand, of course, what the policy implications are of the move. But actually moving accounts is no big deal at all.
Okay, great. That's good to know. I'm about to ask the last question, which is currently in here. So, but there is still some time left. So if people, another question's coming in, so we'll get that in a second. I was going to ask though, does using that DLT reseller add significant cost to you? And actually, let me add a follow on to that. Does it help smooth over cost spikes? Are you sort of prepaying for some amount of capacity and but not having to worry about going over budget so much?
Yeah, we're not using our reseller that way. So in the agreement we have right now, they're actually not adding cost at all. We don't see a cost for DLT. They have their agreement with AWS, and I assume that they get some chunk of what we pay to AWS, but we don't see a difference. In fact, because of the way that our contract is negotiated, we're seeing a discount off of the AWS rack rates that you would get if you were using a public credit card or something. So in that case, we don't really see any additional cost. outside of the billing portion, they're not managing it for us. I know there are other resellers that will do more management for you at that cost. So there's certainly a trade-off there as you look at different resellers. Sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Do they help protect you against cost spikes?
Yeah, today they don't. That's not something that they're doing. We have had discussions with them about how they might be able to do that. The other thing that fits into that in our particular agreement, because Net Plus is part of Internet 2, and therefore we're a part of a consortium of schools that are buying into that, is they've even talked about the idea of could they purchase things like reserved instances and savings plans across multiple schools, so that they could actually sort of amortize the cost, but that would create some level of protection against overspending by the reseller owning the reserved instance rather than the school owning it. So it's not something we're doing today. I know that there are other resellers out there that are looking into that kind of thing. And I think it's definitely an interesting conversation to have with resellers as you look around.
Great, thanks. Next question, Dan asks, do you have any thoughts on the relative strengths or weaknesses of the different cloud providers, AWS, Azure, GCP?
That's a very broad question. I think the first thing I would say is I have yet to find anybody who, outside of very short-lived workloads, gets a lot of benefit around trading pennies for CPU cores. You know, you can look at the costs around, okay, it costs 2 cents less to run on GCP than it does on AWS today. Over the long run, you're going to probably spend more in learning curve than you are in the actual savings around that. So that I have not seen be very valuable. I think that AWS has a lot of complexity, but they also have kind of the newest, fanciest, flashiest stuff. GCP worries me a little bit in some cases because they have a little bit of a reputation of shutting things down that people are using. But I think that they also have, especially around the Kubernetes ecosystem, some very strong services. So I'm very interested in them as we drive more into the Kubernetes world. Azure, of course, is super strong in the Microsoft world. And anybody who's a big Microsoft customer, they're going to have a lot of detail. And I don't mean that to say that Linux workloads on Azure don't work great. They do. We've had no issues with that at all. But I think when you get into integration with Active Directory and the ability to leverage a lot of the Active Directory suite of things and integrate with your desktop management and all that kind of stuff, Azure really has a lot of power. So that's a few things, but I mean, they're really complex platforms. So that's not in any way a comprehensive answer.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Eric. What AWS services are being used most at your organization? And are there any services that you were surprised to see being used?
I would say in terms of cost, EC2 is still our largest cost in terms of the services being used. That's not super surprising because when you buy EC2, you pay for the hour that you're using it. And whether you run anything on that hour or not, you pay for it. I think in terms of actual volume of different things running on it, it's been really interesting to me to see how many teams were willing to dive into different serverless technologies, be that Lambda or be it things like AWS Glue, which is used for data transformations. We've had a lot of usage of that. So that's probably been a little bit of the both most used as well as the most surprising. When we first got into this, we really did think that a lot of people would be looking to just move VMs. And very quickly, we got into a lot of people who wanted to use serverless in a variety of different formats. So we've seen quite a bit of that, including the application that we just rolled out this last semester where people are checking in, doing their COVID check-ins on campus is all done using serverless technologies. There's no server behind that. There's no EC2, any of that kind of stuff. It's all API gateway and Lambda, that kind of stuff.
No, that's awesome. Thank you. David asks, how do you and your team approach or manage trying to keep up with the churn and rapid release of new services in the cloud?
Yeah, this is a challenging one for sure. I would say that we definitely carve out time around the times of year where we know there's going to be big drops of services. So reInvent has been going on the last few weeks, and we have slowed down our development work in order to just focus on what new is coming out, spend a little bit of time actually spinning up the new services and doing enough proof of concept work to make sure we kind of have our head around what is this thing, what does it do, and when somebody comes to ask us about it, what is it? We also make sure we maintain time every sprint for training. So we try to maintain our Friday afternoons for sharpen the saw time, specifically with this in mind, because if we didn't, we wouldn't keep up. And that's really still focused mostly on AWS. As we expand into the other clouds, I think this is going to continue to get more challenging. I will say, when I first got into this work, I was much more worried about this than I am now, only because as you get into particular clouds, you quickly find that many of these services sort of fall into categories. And once you can understand a particular category, then you start to see that the new service kind of falls into that category, and you can make some assumptions from the previous category by association. So it's not as hard as it first seems when you just see the 300 new services that came out last week from AWS or whatever it was by number, because most of those were really extensions of existing services, and you can kind of quickly go down the list and say, okay, I sort of understand those, and get down to the 50 or so, which is still a lot, but 50 that you need to kind of dig into a little bit to understand more.
Great, thank you. Brian asks, what was the hardest aspect of getting CU's cloud use organized and managed? What would you do differently if starting now, given what you know now?
Honestly, I think the hardest part is still, and this is still true today, there's just a chicken and egg problem here, right? Is that until we enable the use of cloud, people see it as the kind of thing of, well, I can't really go down that road because there's some obstacle in my way. But then they choose not to use it. And so their project isn't pushing down that road to create demand for us to fill. And so we're kind of constantly caught in this cycle of, we don't want to overpromise and set ourselves up for failure by saying we can deliver something that we really can't do. But at the same time, we have to promise enough that people are willing to say, yeah, I'm willing to put my project on that and rely on the fact that you're going to deliver what you say you're going to deliver so that I can use that service in the time frame that I need it. And that's a constant challenge. And it's a constant challenge, especially in the current budget times where we're saying, well, okay, we got to do that with existing staff. So that's really the hardest part of it, I think, is just how do you build a sustainable model around staffing something like this? Because it's always secondary. There's always the application or the research or the project that would like to use the cloud. And then there's the enablement team. And the enablement team is always the sort of the second thought that people have. I would love to say that someone would come along and say, we're all moving to the cloud next week. And there have been organizations that have done that and have really put a lot of money behind it. It's an interesting bet for organizations to make. I think that it does make a lot of sense to say, let's make sure that there's value there before we commit a lot of resources to it. But it kind of creates this back and forth of we have to show the value so that we can take that next step and continue to show the value, and we're constantly on that treadmill. If I was starting again now, I think that I would probably spend more time evaluating what was really being asked by most of our clients. Probably the biggest place that I feel like we haven't spent enough time is on the education stuff. And that came up in some of the early questions, right? The learning curve piece. I think that we've spent a lot of time on the technical enablement and the business enablement side and not enough on the just education side of things. And I would like to have more resources to spend just teaching people generally about cloud and how to use it. And I think that's something that as we go forward, we'll spend some more time on.
Yeah, good point. David asks, has your team investigated or implemented Service Catalog? If so, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so Service Catalog, AWS Service Catalog is a product that basically allows you to package certain chunks of functionality and then allow people to basically order one of those for their account. So you could say, here's our standard EC2 instance. And then you could publish that out to your organization and say, okay, if you want an EC2 instance, you can order one of these, and you can basically give people parameters. So you can say, okay, I want size small, medium, large, whatever. Right now, Service Catalog is what we're using. It's built into Control Tower. So when we create new accounts, Service Catalog is the product that's being used for that. Our data lake team is actually looking at service catalog as a part of their strategy for taking those accounts and adding on to them. So if we have some particular organization that needs extra data analytics software in their account, the data lake team might be able to provision them that stuff through service catalog. And we're looking at how we can use service catalog to actually drive provisioning of Terraform going forward. But most of our implementation today is what comes with Control Tower. I think it has a lot of potential. I will say the biggest downside I've seen with it so far is it's very rigid about managing the things that it's deployed. And so you really have to make sure that if you want to change something, it changes through service catalog. And when you make that change through service catalog, expect it to take a while. It's very slow when you make a change. So if you wanted to go back, say with that EC2 instance and say, well, I said I wanted small, but I really want it to be medium, you have to make that change through service catalog and expect it to take a while. So that's probably the one downside I've seen with it, but I think it's got a lot of potential and we'll keep looking at it.
Okay, sounds good. Joel asks, what's your security workflow like outside of the AWS services, Detective, Security Hub, etc.? Any log processing / analysis, use of AWS Firewall, etc.?
So outside of AWS services, like I said, we're sending our CloudTrail logs today to our security event management system, and they're doing some level of signature detection based on that. We're not doing a lot beyond that today. It's certainly something we've talked about. We're also not using Firewall today. We've looked at it, but it's not something we've implemented so far. We have detection rules in place for if someone were to open a security group in a way that we think is likely to be problematic, and then we can follow up based on that, but we don't actually prevent it with something like Firewall or something along those lines. I'm not sure I'm really answering the question though, so if there's more there, I'm happy to follow up.
Okay, well, if Joel adds a follow-up, we'll do that. We are getting near the top of the hour. Currently, this is the last question in the chat, unless somebody posts one up real soon. It's from me. Could another organization such as NCAR leverage what CU has done to do something similar without relearning all your lessons? And I'm just going to insert actually a follow-on, which is, can you tell us sort of roughly how many people you have at CU kind of focused on helping the organization use the cloud? You know, the kind of scope of your own organization, or the size of your organization.
Yeah, so my team right now is myself and one other person who are focused on this landing zone piece. I would say we're stretched pretty thin in terms of what we're doing right now, but we've been able to get by with the two of us. Yeah, absolutely. There's no reason that we couldn't help another organization take on some of this without relearning what we've learned. There's been a lot of the learning curve that we have climbed with help from other organizations. So I think that there's definitely that opportunity, and there are organizations out there that are all about the sharing of this stuff.
Great, thank you. So that was the end of the questions. Jason, I want to thank you very much. That was a great seminar. I wish we could be in the room and you could hear everybody clapping and everything, and we could take you out for a happy hour after the talk. But I guess that'll have to wait until things quiet down. But thanks again for speaking. I don't know if people do have follow-up questions, they could route them through me or contact me directly. What I will say, we have the next CISL seminar scheduled is, let me just check, January, what is it? Looks like January 20th. We have another CISL seminar. So I invite everybody to come to that. And Jason, thank you again very much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.